My name is Bill Penuel, and I'm on the faculty in the School of Education and the Institute of Cognitive Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I'm also co-founder of the Inquiry Hub Research Practice Partnership. That's been a long-term partnership between Denver Public Schools and the University of Colorado, along with a wide variety of other community and university partners. So design-based implementation research, or DBIR as it's most commonly referred to, is an integration of two different kinds of research broadly: design-based research and implementation research. Design-based research is a kind of research that's typically taken place in a handful of classrooms and is a form of research where researchers work with a handful of educators, usually in partnership, to design and test an innovation in the crucible of a classroom to bring about a certain form of learning. And implementation research is a study of what happens when people implement something across a range of settings. And it's about understanding how people adapt innovations and practices in classrooms and other kinds of settings, as well as understanding the conditions that support and hinder the productive adaptation of innovations and practices. What's distinctive about this blend that DBIR is that it's focused on gathering and using implementation evidence formatively to help make innovation work in a variety of settings and be productively adaptable across a wide variety of settings. And the aim is equitable implementation of powerful innovations, as well as the sustainability of those innovations. The foundational principles of these are four, and they work together synergistically. One is that there's a focus on persistent problems of practice that are negotiated from multiple interest holders' perspectives. Two, that there's a commitment to iterative collaborative design. Third, there's a concern with developing both theory and knowledge related both to the setting of learning, where it is, whether that's a classroom or out of school space, and theory and knowledge related to implementation through systematic inquiry. And fourth, there's a concern with developing capacity for sustaining change in systems. Within this, equity is a cross-cutting theme in these principles. For example, in its emphasis on identifying and negotiating problems of practice, we're trying to focus and center the concerns, aims, and values and experiences of practitioners, researchers, other interest holders. And also in the co-design work, we want to give a say especially to interest holders who usually don't have a seat at the table of designing what innovations and practices look like. When I'm introducing it to new people, I emphasize this is not something that an individual investigator takes or learns on their own. It requires apprenticeship, it requires multidisciplinary expertise, and a real disposition to be open to different kinds of knowledge, including practical knowledge, as a source of theory even, to guide the work. And for anyone used to being in control of what an intervention looks like, or of the research design, this openness I find can be a pretty big challenge. And I want people from the start to appreciate this is super messy work, requires continuous and mutual adaptation among partners to this ongoing and changing situation on the ground. DBIR projects unfold importantly in emerging and long-term research practice partnerships. I don't think that when we started building this, we understood how important that is. I often say that partnerships are this basket that holds tenderly the work that unfolds, that involves framing a problem to work on across different interest holders, developing and iterating on a complex intervention, and actually actively supporting and studying implementation at the same time. The work will unfold across different levels of a system, like classrooms plus central offices of school districts, or across different settings that are connected together in a kind of ecosystem of learning. In contrast to, say, for example, I think a lot of networked improvement communities DBIR is almost always place-based, meaning it's focused on a specific community, district, school that can be thought of as a system with its own governance structure that's going to last beyond the project. And that's because one of the key activities in DBIR is something we call infrastructuring. That is the redesign of forms of guidance for teaching and learning that are typically the purview of people like district curriculum leaders, instructional coaches, associate superintendents, assessment coordinators, or in the case of out-of-school settings, program managers, exhibit designers, and executive directors and their boards. The partners, of course, can be almost anybody who has a stake or interest in the problem within a system. I know of DBIR projects where young people are partners in design, many where teachers are involved as co-designers, also where there are community organizations involved. There are DBIR partnerships at the level of schools, districts, and state agencies. And it's pretty typical that you get partners across settings or levels in a system because of the nature of the work. There's a lot of risk that's involved in testing out a design at the level of a system. And partners have shared risk, but unequal risk in this work. Practice partners on the practice side bear much more risk. So partnerships are one way that as researchers, we come to the table and say, we're willing to share in some of that risk by being with you long term, by not creating a mess and then leaving, but all interventions create messes. We're there to help respond to the mess that we create in that process. And when there's a strong partnership, it creates this sense of shared risk that I think is important for the work, even though it's almost always asymmetric. Ultimately, I think of it as for the who it's for to benefit. That is, I think we're trying to create just and sustainable systems of education. And I think its most important beneficiaries are the children, youth, and families who are part of that system. Also, because I work closely with educators in school, I'm always thinking about ways that their opportunities to grow and develop in the context of a DBIR project can benefit their well-being, be humanizing, be compassionate, support their growth in a way that affirms them as professionals and people. Typically, it brings researchers and professionals together, I would say, are the dominant form. Sometimes youth and families are involved, but I also think there are better improvement methodologies for that are more family-centered design approaches, community-based design research, such as Anne Ishimaru and Megan Bang use, that are more keyed to that. So in some ways, DBIR does work with people in institutionalized positions of power often, precisely because we're trying to make changes to systems that require power to do that work. That it's great when you're working within a single community, or I use the term jurisdiction because that connotes a political entity, and when you're interested also in making changes to educational infrastructures that are going to allow for robust, effective, and equitable innovations to be implemented and sustained. When working across communities, across jurisdictions, it can really be a lot harder to do the organizing work needed to make those changes to infrastructure, because maybe there's only one person who represents a school or district, or the political contexts are really different and you need to learn from variation in a different way than you would in a DBIR project, more like you might in a networked improvement community. As an example, we've organized partnership work as a NIC working across all 50 states in science education because people needed to work on different parts of a theory of action based on their political context. They were not allowed to work on certain equity projects, for example, but they could work on other equity projects that were part of a broader vision for change. So when you're working, that's not to say any individual political context isn't divided itself. They often are. But across jurisdictions, it can be especially messy. I think that it works best when the partners have at least some influence over some of the policies and infrastructures that influence teaching and learning in a particular system. I say some very strongly because all decision making in complex educational systems is distributed. It unfolds over time with different meetings and spaces. Decisions get undone all the time. But influence is over, say, what assessment looks like. If you're creating an innovation with more ambitious learning goals than you are typically assessed in school districts is pretty important. You might need influence over teacher observation protocols if you're designing a new curriculum, for example, that asks for different forms of teaching. Otherwise, it's hard to get educators to try things. And some of that is because of the incoherence of the guidance they're receiving, but also there's a lot of risk, especially if the person who's evaluating them comes in and they actually determine, the well-being of this teacher in the long run in that system and their survival in the system, whereas you're an outside innovator coming in. So having some influence over these parts of the system is really key for the infrastructuring work. Similarly, you have to have partners who are willing to give you some kind of seat at the table to think, even as a thought partner, about those infrastructural changes that might be needed. With infrastructuring, it's that in a large school district or state system, changes are coming at you to infrastructures all the time from different layers of the system, from political entities like a school board, and being able to be responsive and nimble while holding on to the core of what you're doing is really challenging. It goes back to that disposition that I think is required for this work, which is a deep nimbleness, but also a sense of these are our core goals, these are our principles, these are the values that we follow, this is our sense of the problem we're trying to solve. And it requires reframing for people as new things come in and helping bridge to different initiatives and help people see the connections. And that's very intensive work. You often don't have enough people to do the work that's sufficient for that. Turnover is another thing that people always are concerned about. I've worked with many, many district science coordinators in my partnership with Denver over the years. And each time you have to have built a deep set of relationships with educators and other folks in the system who might move to different positions, sometimes into powerful positions that can benefit you and your partnership work. As like mobility is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be very challenging because you can often need to restart work. You're always restarting building the relationships. So the relationship maintenance is a continuous thing. So I'm going to go back to partnerships here and point to a book that Dan Gallagher and I wrote on creating research practice partnerships in education in 2017 about how educators and researchers might productively approach each other. So a DBIR project can start anywhere and from any who. Like with a problem, a vague goal, a researcher coming to a new place or district and introducing themselves to folks in a central office about the kinds of things they do and wondering about how to help. I would say that for a researcher, a desire to serve or responding productively to a request for service from a practice organization is often an auspicious way to begin, especially more so than I have a proposal that's mostly written or an intervention that's ready to go. Would you like to be part of my study? And I'll call that a partnership. So that's less auspicious. I think really it's the openness of the approach. And again, the willingness to be approached as well as to approach and to begin maybe not where you expected the work to be because the problem that you're working on is definitely not the problem that you approached the person with or that they approached you with if you're doing it right, because this problem space is jointly negotiated. And I always say, when you put a slide up in a talk to say, here's the problem we're working on, you want everybody to be able to see themselves in the work and say, yeah, that's the work we're doing. That's the problem we're trying to solve. And that takes some time to get to that there. And it's also something that evolves.